Welcome to The Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. In this 4-episode series brought to you by the Liberty Fund, I'll be speaking with Aurelian Craiutu, professor of political science at Indiana University, Bloomington. He is also an adjunct professor in the American Studies program and the Lilly Family School of Philanthropic Studies at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. We're here to talk about his latest book, which he edited and published with the Liberty Fund, a modern interpretation of Jacques Necker's 1792 work on executive power in great states. Necker, interestingly enough, was a Swiss statesman and banker appointed by King Louis XVI to be France's director of the Royal Treasury and later Director General of Finances. Necker's text is an examination of executive power and compares the French political system with those of America and England, offering a robust defense of representative government. Necker's thesis was somewhat novel at the time, arriving well before other more prominent political thinkers, such as Tocqueville, returned their sights on America's political landscape. Even so, Necker never managed to capture as much popular interest. This, perhaps, can be attributed to his moderate political views. Moderates, the thinking goes, don't stick out as much as their more radically leaning colleagues. Nevertheless, the book and Necker's ideas resonate in the context of today's contentious political environment. In this second episode, Dr. Craiutu and I continue our conversation and talk about Necker's moderate political views, which arguably caused his seminal text to be left behind as other more radical political thinkers entered the world stage. Okay, excellent. So Necker saw himself as a moderate, and in your introduction to Liberty Fund's new edition of On Executive Power, you write, Necker fully embraced the label of moderate and the concept of the golden mean. You go on to quote his characterization of the moderate as being, quote, struck by all the crossing hands, and as they are passed by the accelerated march of the passions, as they are left behind by new ideas and modern systems, they fall into disrespect, and their character is accused of feebleness, end quote. I'm wondering if you could characterize Necker's moderate views and why, perhaps, based on that quote, why he seemed kind of down on that.
I would like to answer the question by quoting Necker himself. He refers to his attachment to quote, wise and moderate principles, and he defends them as follows. And this is Necker now. I have never run after systematic novelties. I have been partial only to approved maxims, though even these I have not constantly defended like a servile enthusiast. For from time to time, I think I have shown the power of seizing ideas at their first origin. The only difference is that in raising myself to this level, I have not remained suspended in the clouds as some of the metaphysical politicians of our time. So what does it mean when we call Necker a moderate? As he himself points out in this self-portrait, he never remained in the clouds as some of other actors, he called them metaphysical politicians of his time, did, which means that he never ran after systematic novelties. He tried to strike a balance between reverence for the past and necessary reforms. And it is here, I would say, that the core of his moderation lies. Necker was a defender of monarchy, but he was not a defender of absolute monarchy. He understood the importance of constitutional monarchy. If you wish, his preferred model was the English constitutional monarchy, a theme that appears in the book on executive power in great states, but also in his other major work of 1796 on the French Revolution. He admires the English constitutional monarchy for combining wisely and judiciously a concern for order and a concern for reform and liberty. And Necker thought that the French could do the same, and his political moderation led him to defend a form of constitutional monarchy that was suitable to France. The other thing that is important to point out here is that he was a critic of the doctrine of the sovereignty of the people. The sovereignty of the people was a powerful doctrine during the French Revolution, but he thought that the sovereignty of the people needed some moderating devices, and you cannot allow the people to govern themselves. This was 1789, 1792, 1796 when he made those comments, so they have to be read in the context. But they are the expression of his political moderation. The third point that is worth mentioning here, which doesn't appear necessarily in the fragment that I've cited, is and quoted, is his position on equality. Necker wrote a beautiful appendix to his book on the French Revolution entitled Philosophical Reflections on Equality, in which he makes a case that equality must be understood in a complex way, like the concept of sovereignty. So he's not a defender of absolute equality. He thought that the French were enamored with the concept of abstract equality, the metaphysician of his time, and they lost sight of the context in which these ideas have to be applied. So he defended a notion of complex sovereignty, complex equality, if you wish, that combines forms of equality with forms of legitimate inequality. And this combination, this eclecticism, I think, reflects his political moderation. So he was a political moderate by temperament, but also a political moderate by actions, by his actions. He defended constitutional monarchy. He was a man of reforms. He pushed for the reforms in the financial sector, as I mentioned before. He understood very clearly that France needed political reforms, but certainly not as far as other more radical figures, such as Sieyès, wanted at the time. So he wanted to open up the kingdom in a moderate way so that France could become a form of constitutional monarchy like England's.
Okay. There was something I wanted to sort of circle back on, and I'm wondering if there's a hint in there in sort of Necker's description of his political philosophy and what perhaps might have motivated him to make the budget public in 1770 or 1781, unless that was, fully agreed, the monarchy was okay with that move, or if he did that independently, and if that in some way reflected his own political views.
I think the decision to make public the finances of the kingdom in 1781 was a very courageous one, and it actually was a risky decision that led to his dismissal in May of 1781. And in that respect, Necker, I think, was a true reformer, because something like this had not been done before in France. And it showed a commitment to publicity, which is a very important concept. The idea that there are certain things that, in order to be legitimate, must be made public, and ways in which the money of the kingdom, the finances of the kingdom were organized, I think, was one such important political decision that he thought ought to be made public. The public ought to know. And I guess in that respect, he was very reformist. So those who would accuse him of being too conservative would lose sight of this reformist side, and those who would accuse him of being too reformist would certainly lose sight of his, I would say, more conservative side, as illustrated by his critique of the concept of absolute equality and popular sovereignty. So he tried to strike a balance between the two. He was not alone in this regard. There were many others. Well, I wouldn't say many, but there were others who sought to carve out a middle path between the left and the right. From today's perspective, Necker would appear as a kind of liberal conservative thinker, if you wish, precisely for his opposition to equality, or his critique of equality as illustrated by Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Social Contract, for example.
Okay, excellent. You just heard from Aurelian Craiutu, professor of political science at Indiana University, Bloomington, and editor of On Executive Power in Great States by Jacques Necker. This series is brought to you by the Liberty Fund. Join us next week when we continue our conversation and dive a little more deeply into this edition of Necker's On Executive Power in Great States, particularly his main takeaways from his comparative constitutional analysis between France, England, and America.
Necker had left the French political scene in September of 1790, so he had some time, let's say, to reflect away from the sound and fury of politics on what went wrong and what could still be achieved. And let's not forget that the revolution is still very much alive. The king is still on the throne of France when he writes the book, so he has a series of hopes for the kingdom of France. And he shows a certain path that the French ought to have followed, but in the end they did not. So in a way, it's a book that is both a reflection on the past, but also a projection of his hopes and a path to follow for the future.
If you like what you hear, rate us or give us a review on your podcast platform of choice. And if there's a topic you'd like us to cover, drop me a line. I'm at bmickey@ala-choice.org. As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced by Choice's senior digital media producer, Mark Dirks, and digital media assistant, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.